Tonight we're talking about lift lines. This is one of two lectures on this topic. And tonight we're going to focus on finding them and staying on them. How to find them, how to stay on them. And really when we talk about finding a lift line, it's more about recognizing one when you do find it. I don't know that I've figured out the science yet for where to go to look for one, but I can help you learn a little bit about how they're oriented, how they behave, and how to recognize one when you blunder upon one. And it's easier, I promise you, than what this guy's doing. So a lot of guys, when you talk about lift lines, will look at you as if you are trying to tell them about, leprechauns and unicorns. But lift lines are real things. They are subtle. You can fly for 15 years like I did and never be aware of them. But once you learn to be aware of them, you'll find them often. So of course, a lift line, and this is my simple graphical representation of one, is the only one on that page that is not a mythical creature. It's a real thing. And lift lines are a bit like four-leaf clovers in that you almost never find a four-leaf clover if you aren't looking for it. You could step right on it and never know it was there. And lift lines are very similar, so maybe the number one takeaway from tonight is look for them. Think about them, pay attention, and maybe you'll find some. If you don't look for them and don't pay attention, nothing I tell you tonight will help you find any. Now, for some of you, this is a review, the next couple of minutes, on my philosophy on fundamentals versus advanced concepts. This is part one of a two-part series, like I mentioned before. Part one tonight, finding and staying on lift lines. I consider that the fundamentals of lift lines. And part two is the more advanced side of lift lines. I believe it's really important to develop your fundamentals first before you get into advanced concepts. If you try to learn it all at once, or start with the advanced and then move to the fundamentals, it can make it difficult to grasp the fundamental things that are the most beneficial for the least amount of effort. And this is just a representation of that idea that fundamentals, by their nature, tend to yield relatively large benefits from relatively small amounts of effort, compared to advanced concepts, which yield relatively small amounts of benefit for relatively large amounts of effort. This is just the nature of things, that the more advanced you get in something, the harder you have to work to get the same incremental gain. So what I give you tonight will yield a lot more benefit from an hour of study than what you'll get out of the advanced discussion on lift lines. First, let me define lift line, because that's a somewhat vague term. And for right now, it still is somewhat vague. A more or less continuous line of lift or rising air. That's still not as specific as I want to get it, but that's a good starting point. Some people will call this an energy line. So if you hear someone talking about energy lines, you could substitute the word lift for energy, and it means the same thing. I choose to use the word lift line because sync is energetic too. Air that's going up at 2 knots and air that's going down at 2 knots are equally energetic. But I would much prefer the one that's going up. So it's a little more specific, I believe, to say lift line, although I don't know that I've heard anyone yet talk about energy lines when they were meaning sink. But I prefer the term lift line for what it's worth. Here are some types of lift lines. That was a pretty broad definition. Lift in a line. Ridge lift. Ridges often are semi-straight, straight enough we could call it a line. And the lift that organizes over the upwind side, you could call that a lift line by the definition I just gave you. You could have some sort of trigger on the terrain. Maybe it's a ridge, maybe it's a tree line, and it could be oriented in any given direction. But if it triggers thermals all up and down this line, then in the air above and downwind of that, you'll have a line mimicking the line that triggered it. So it'll be parallel and shifted in the downwind direction. You could probably rightly call that a lift line. Wave lift tends to form in fairly straight lines. If it's formed by mountains, if it's a mountain wave, then it may have the undulating shape of the ridge that created it. If it's higher aloft atmospheric waves, it might tend to be straighter, but still straight enough that we can call it a line. Thermals often are somewhat stretched out or elongated with the wind in the horizontal dimension. So you could find yourself in a thermal or sort of a thermal area for half a mile to a mile flying straight upwind or downwind. You might could call that a lift line. That's stretching it in my book. That's kind of a short distance to call it a line, but maybe. You could have a convergence line, say over a plateau with valleys on both sides. Plateau heats, the air lifts over it, air goes up, and then out over the valleys to the sides, the air comes back down, and you get this convergence system that sets up over the plateau. And if the plateau is relatively straight in the shape of a line, your convergence will be in the shape of a line. The so-called Florida Ridge convergence that sets up down the peninsula of Florida could rightly be called a lift line. And then there are cloud streets, definitely lined up thermals parallel to the wind, with or without clouds on top of them. And this is the type of lift line that I'm talking about tonight. You may hear me refer to it as a thermal lift line. It's a line of thermal lift oriented parallel to the wind. Cloud streets or blue streets, streets and lines, those words are somewhat synonymous. But it doesn't have to be, the streeting doesn't have to be as organized as you might see in a classic cloud streeting day for there to be usable lift lines. So there are degrees of organization and vigor of the lines. A good classic cloud street day is a 10. But I'm going to teach you tonight how to find the average everyday lift lines that are just, 3s or 4s on this scale and make use of them. And maybe there are others. I probably haven't exhausted all the things that you could call lift lines, but tonight we'll be talking about thermal lift lines parallel to the wind, like cloud streets or blue streets. So I'd like to hear from some of you, just to know who I have in the audience. Have you ever spent more than a minute or so on a lift line without climbing? And I say without climbing because if it's a strong enough line that you can climb while you're on it, then that's a no-brainer. That's a little bit easier to work. So what I'm talking about is you were in lift. You weren't sinking as much as you ordinarily would at that speed, but it wasn't strong enough to climb, and you managed to stay on it for a minute or more. So our objectives tonight are big long preface here. Compared to more or less random flying, by that I mean you have no idea where to go to look for lift lines or how they're oriented or anything. So compared to more or less random flying, with a Vario setup, the standard way hang gliding and paragliding Varios are set up, which I'll explain what I mean, and we don't have any of those guys in here tonight, but I'll still explain it for you just in case. So compared to that, tonight you should learn how in moderate wind conditions, 10 to 15 mile per hour winds, conditions with thermals, how to find about twice as many thermals, and how to, while you're on a lift line at least, double your glide range. That's just a rough guess, assuming that the average run-of-the-mill lift line in these type conditions has lift in it as strong as about half of your sink rate at glide speed. This is a chart from a popular hang gliding Vario manufacturer manual showing you how the audio is set up. And out of the box, hang gliding and paragliding instruments are set up with a fairly large, what I call a quiet zone. In this particular manual, they called it a soundless range. And it's a range of vertical speeds where the Vario is silent. If you're sinking really quickly, you'll get what this particular manual calls a sink tone or a sink alarm. And if you're climbing, except for a little bitty null zone there, you will hear beeping. I would strongly encourage people who are flying with a quiet zone to get rid of it. Fortunately, in the sailplane world, I think is a little ahead of the hang gliding and paragliding world in this regard, because it seems that sailplane Varios don't come out of the box with a quiet zone. They typically are set up to make sound at all vertical speeds, which I think is a good thing. I think it's a good thing because it makes it easier to hear subtle lift and sink, like near the edge of a thermal or like a lift line. You might want a small quiet zone if you were a hang glider or a paraglider pilot, just to keep it quiet on launch. I never liked the noise of my Vario while I'm standing on the edge of a cliff waiting for a safe launch cycle. It's just an extra annoyance I don't need, and the sound doesn't tell you anything other than that the air swirling over this cliff is turbulent. So a quiet zone of plus or minus 20 feet per minute might be enough, plus or minus 40 definitely. And the Flytec instruments, most of them now at least, have what they call a near thermal tone that has a nice feature of automatically being muted while you're on the ground. And within a few seconds of taking flight, it detects that you've launched and eliminates even that small quiet zone for you. I was talking about this topic of quiet zone with a pretty excellent, not just pretty good, but an excellent paraglider pilot, Luis, I can't say his last name, from Argentina. He has a long sheet of accomplishments, more than I'll ever have. But he said he'd been giving thermal clinics for 20 years to paraglider pilots and always advised eliminating the Vario's quiet zone, and went on to say, to me, a change from minus 100 feet per minute, so about minus 1 knot, to minus 10 feet per minute, minus a tenth of a knot, is the most important information your Vario can give you. And with the standard quiet zone in those instruments, a pilot would never hear that. And something that subtle, minus 100 to minus 10, usually you're not even going to feel it. So unless you hear it, you don't notice it. Let's talk about some Vario audio mode names. We'll talk about why in a minute. This only applies to speed to fly Varios. but these are typical in sailplanes. Here are a set of different terms that all mean the same thing. Climb and cruise mode is probably the most common terminology I hear in sailplane Varios. Condor uses this terminology, lift and cruise mode. So they use the word lift instead of climb, lift mode instead of climb mode. But then in other places in Condor, they use totally different terminology. They say Vario mode in place of climb mode, or speed command mode in place of cruise mode. Flytec instruments, as far as I can tell, there is no term for climb mode, but they call cruise mode McCready audio. So the point of this is just know the terminology of your instrument, and if you come across any of these terms, maybe you'll recognize now that they're synonymous. I don't know why we can't all agree on the same terminology, but that would just be too non-human of us, I suppose. And here's how these modes, these two modes, I'll call them climb and cruise mode, behave. Climb mode, generally speaking, and it can be implemented slightly differently from one Vario to another, so if you want to know more in more detail, check out your particular manual and see how yours works. But generally speaking, the sound directly reflects vertical speed in some way. Sound is related to vertical speed. And in climb mode, a pretty common feature is that you get sound at all vertical speeds, minus any desired quiet zone if you have one of these hang gliding or paragliding instruments that can notch out a quiet zone. Climb mode audio is typically what I would call high resolution. With just a little bit of change in vertical speed, you hear a noticeable change in audio. And it also has very low lag. So the typical lag in a Vario in climb mode is on the order of a second to a second and a half. And you can't get much lower lag than that before the audio just sounds real squirrely. But in this mode, you can pretty easily and quickly hear small changes in vertical speed. In cruise mode, also generally speaking, the sound relates to your ideal speed to fly. So the sound relates to airspeed, horizontal speed basically, rather than vertical speed. Cruise mode is often implemented so that when you're at or near the ideal speed to fly, so you're at the ideal speed to fly plus or minus a few knots maybe, it's quiet. And that's how you know when you've nailed it. You have the right airspeed. You'll hear a sound if you're too slow or too fast, but when you're at or pretty near the ideal speed, it's quiet. And cruise mode audio is usually delayed, averaged out over a period of time. You know, it's not simply delayed, as in let's just wait 15 seconds to tell this guy what's going on. It's delayed in the sense that it's averaged. So your cruise mode audio doesn't want you to be constantly chasing the optimum airspeed. So by averaging out things over 10 or 15 seconds, it helps smooth the piloting experience. So the next question is, when you're on glide, which is the best mode? Cruise or climb mode? Unless you change your McCready setting to maintain the optimum speed, usually basically just means holding a constant speed. So once you get there, maintaining it is just a matter of holding it. Unless you fly into air that's lifting a good bit or sinking a good bit, you're just flying at the same speed. And a lot of people would argue Even if you do fly into a little lift or a little sink, don't chase the speed so much, because you end up being out of sync, and you get slow just before you go into the sink, or you get fast just before you go into the lift. So we won't get too far into that, but basically maintaining the best speed just means holding a constant speed. If you fly through the edge of a thermal, so you fly into a little bit of light lift and or sink, it may not prompt a change in your ideal speed enough to even invoke your cruise mode audio, assuming it was silent because you're already at the right speed. Or even if it does, it may be 10 or 15 seconds later. In climb mode, however, you will almost immediately hear lift or sink that you fly into that is strong enough to interest you. You'll even hear lift or sink you fly into that might not be strong enough to interest you, which is good. You'll hear a good bit. And if you wanted to stay in climb mode on glide, but you want to occasionally check and see whether you're flying at the right speed, you could just switch it back to cruise mode briefly, occasionally. The only pilot I've known yet, and you can probably see here that I prefer and I recommend climb mode even while on glide. But the only guy I've come across yet who strongly preferred cruise mode, even after having this particular lecture, went and tested climb mode on glide for a few flights and reported back that he changed his mind. It was eye-opening to him how much more he could hear of what was going on in the air using climb mode on glide. So he switched. In an ideal world, my preference is to have climb mode audio while on glide, but with a visual speed to fly indicator. Condor offers this option, and that's the way I fly in Condor. And a lot of modern sailplane Varios offer this option too. Unfortunately, my old LNAV in my LS3 does not. So how do you invoke cruise or climb mode? How do you switch between the modes if you want to? Like I have to do in my LS3. I have to take some special action if I want climb mode audio while on glide. Otherwise, the LS3 automatically switches between those modes. Most sailplane Varios automatically switch, like mine does, between cruise and climb mode based on whether you're circling or flying straight. If you have an instrument like mine, you might need to install a switch to override this automatic switching behavior. The manual will tell you how to do that. On mine, it's a couple of pins in a wiring harness, and if you just install a switch across those two pins, and when you close that switch, so when you short across those pins, it overrides it and locks it into climb mode. Flip the switch the other way and it goes back to auto switching, which if you're on glide means it takes it back to cruise mode. In a hang glider or paraglider, if you're flying with the instrument I talked about earlier, a Flytec 6030, it defaults to climb mode on glides. So I gave props earlier to the sailplane world for not having a quiet zone, but I'm going to give props a little bit to the hang gliding world here for giving climb mode audio on glide by default with a visual speed to fly indicator. I think that's the optimal configuration. A pilot who uses this instrument doesn't have to think about this. He doesn't have to be taught these ideas. It comes out of the box this way for him, and I think that's just about ideal. In this instrument, you must manually invoke what they call McCready audio mode, which is just cruise mode when you want it. In Condor, it will stay in climb mode forever until you push the key or button that's assigned to toggle between lift and cruise or climb and cruise modes. It's the right control key by default. I have 3 stories to tell you tonight. I'm going to tell you the first one now. Stories about lift lines, testimonials of sorts. I had been flying for 15 years when I figured out some things that led to me noticing lift lines for the first time ever. And this is a story of one of the first times I ever used a lift line. This launch site here is where I did most of my flying in gliders, hang gliders. It's a few miles from where I now fly sailplanes. And we locals would often try to fly this triangle from our launch to one of these peaks out here, then to the other one, and then back to launch. And it's only about 6 miles, but these ridges are only about 800 feet above the ground. And all this out here is very flat and has a little river running through it, Flint River here. So what that means is after it rains, it takes a few days for it to dry out. The thermals out here are just not often very good. So we often feel and in a hang glider, ground speed in a 10 or 15 mile an hour headwind, which is what it takes for this to be ridge soarable for us, ground speed's pretty low, 10 to 15 mile per hour ground speed going upwind. So even just going this 2 miles here can take you 8 minutes, just if I did my math right, even without stopping to climb. So it's a difficult triangle to do, as small as it may seem for someone flying sailplanes. You almost had to climb up several thousand feet above the ridge and just do it on one glide. But I tended to not want to do that, because if I was able to climb that high, I would turn and go downwind and not come back. But one day I was flying here, and the climbs were not high enough to interest me in a long-distance cross-country flight, and I had just started learning about lift lines, and sure enough, I found one that was passing almost right through launch. That's the red line here. And I followed this line slowly, very slowly, out here, found a thermal or two on it, a time or two. And when I got about here, I gave up on it, went over and tagged the first turn point, found a little thermal off that hill, tagged the other turn point, and came back. After 15 years, I had never flown this triangle. And the first time I was able to do it, it was a lift line that helped me do it. A mediocre, run-of-the-mill, never made my Vario beep lift line on a day with mediocre conditions, not even good enough conditions to get me 4,000 feet above the valley. Let's talk a little about using feel. I'm generally not a touchy-feely kind of pilot. I'm much more analytical. But there are some times when feel, or at least keen observation of what the air is doing to you, are important. And with lift lines, that's the case. The number 1 rule is make sure your glider is tuned to fly straight. Meaning you take your hands and feet off the controls, it should still fly straight, or at least on average, turn right as often as it turns left. So you don't I'm not necessarily saying you want a very roll stable glider, one that won't roll off into a bank. But if it rolls one direction twice as much as the other, you probably have a slight turn that needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, it will mask subtleties like lift lines and make it really hard for you to notice them. In a hang glider, they put these nice caps on the ends of the leading edges that you can release a set screw, rotate it a little. You're either adding or removing twist to the wing, and then tighten your set screw back down. And so you can really fine-tune the wing, and I did. I was obsessive about it. I drilled, I think I had 2 holes between 2 factory drilled adjustment holes before I found the exact right position. But it's that important. The more symmetrical your glider is, the more it rolls right just as much as it rolls left, the more you can just let go of the controls and trust that whichever way it rolls, it was the air that made it roll that way. In sailplanes, it could be something like one of your spoilers is raised, an 1/8 of an inch, even when it's fully retracted, or maybe you have a piece of tape curling up somewhere, taping your gaps, and maybe that could cause a very slight turn in one direction. But whatever it is, this is something you can do when it gets boring at the end of the day and the air is really smooth. Do some straight flight tests. You may have to do 5 or 10 of them and tally up how many times it went right, how many times it went left. And if it goes right, or if it goes one way twice as much as the other, look for the reason and see if you can fix it. Next, once you have your glider tuned to fly nice and straight, use a light grip. If you're white knuckling the stick, you're probably not going to notice much of what's happening, much of what the air is doing, and you may be tempted to just immediately correct. You kind of, when it's really subtle and smooth and you're in or near lift lines, you're out trolling for lift lines, you kind of want to let the wing go a little bit. Let it go a little right, let it go a little left. Don't just force it to stay level, or you may have just covered up the influence of a lift line and not know it was there. It's sort of like most of us, when you're driving down the road, grip the steering wheel really hard and then gradually release it. And at some point, you'll notice your car's trying to pull one direction or the other. It almost always is, whether it's the crown of the road or a slight misalignment or a brake grabbing a little on one side. Whatever it is, our cars are almost always pulling slightly one way. But you won't feel that if you're white knuckling the steering wheel. Try it. What you're really looking to figure out here, this is most important when you're on a lift line trying to stay on it. And what you'd like to know is which side of the line did you just fall off of? Because that's the experience of staying on a lift line. It's not that you can just stay on it continually. You fall off, you get back on. You fall off, you get back on. The key is knowing which side you fell off. The sound from your Vario will be the same either way, whether you fell off the left or the right. So you need to pick up on these subtle cues to know which way it was. And if you have a trim system, most hang gliders do not, don't have in-flight trim. Sailplanes thankfully do. I highly recommend trimming to your flight speed so that you're not having to push or pull at all. Otherwise, you can't really let go of the stick too much because your speed would change. So use the trim or flaps, whatever you're using for trim, to keep it so that you don't have to push or pull on the stick while you're gliding. And take heart if you don't have a great sense of feel at the moment. Just the more you think about it and practice it, and the more experience you get with the air, the better your feel will get. Here's a look from straight above of a textbook lift line. We're looking at a slice out of a lift line. We're looking down on the earth here, and the lift line is passing left to right. And in the green area, there's lift. I say 0 to 200 feet per minute, 0 to 2 knots. I only say that. Really what I mean here is there's lift, but not enough to make your Vario beep. So maybe your cruise sink rate is only 1.3 knots. Well, then say lift here, but less than 1.3 knots. And the sink, the blue is sink. This is just another look at it, a 3D look at it. The red and yellow and green are lift of varying degrees, and the blue is sink. So let's talk about some of the W's, the when, where, and why to look for lift lines. When is virtually any day with sun and wind. So that's most days. I think lift lines, the degree of organization of lift lines tends to be proportional to wind speed. And I would say a good rule of thumb is 10 miles per hour or more of wind speed is enough for there to be enough lift lines out there to interest you. Much less than 10 miles per hour, there don't tend to be that many lift lines. At least not of the type we're talking about tonight, because one key characteristic of the type we're talking about tonight is oriented parallel to the wind. So of course if there's zero wind, then by definition there are no thermal lift lines of the type we're talking about tonight. They're aligned more or less parallel to the wind, and just to clarify what I mean here, these two reddish things are lift lines, and there's the wind blowing straight down them, not across them. If there are cloud streets, then the clouds, the streets of clouds, mark the lines. Cloud streets, the clouds themselves are just the clouds on top of the best thermals in the lift lines. If you fly a crosswind heading, so this is one idea for where or how to look for them. If you fly a crosswind heading, you will encounter the most lift lines, just simply because they're oriented parallel to the wind. If you're flying straight upwind or downwind on a day you think there are lift lines and you're not on one, then you might want to consider veering to the right 20, 30, 40 degrees until you find one, because you may be in a sink line between lift lines. Even if you're not in sync, if you could be in lift, that would be better. While you're ridge soaring, lift lines, and often if there's enough wind to ridge soar, there's enough wind to organize these lift lines. And while you're ridge soaring, a lift line crossing through your ridge lift will manifest itself as a narrow area of better ridge lift that is inexplicable. You look at it and you can't figure out. The terrain is no steeper here. The mountain's no higher here. It's tree covered everywhere, or it's bare everywhere. There's no good reason to explain why the ridge lift should be any better right here, but it is. It doesn't feel like a thermal, it just feels like ridge lift. It's just smooth lift that's a little better. I'm able to get a few 100 feet higher maybe, right here in this narrow area. That's a big clue. If you're ridge soaring, look for that. And of course, a lift line provides a decreased sink rate. If it's a really vigorous lift line, or you're flying a super high performance low sink rate glider, you might even climb on a lift line, but decreased sink rate at a minimum. I was flying in our L-23 Blanik, the one Charles just got through helping put back together tonight. I was flying in it last year, I believe it was, maybe the year before, with one of our club members, and it was a good day, good soaring day. There were thermals, there were cumulus clouds. There might have been some weak organization of clouds into streets, but not very much. But we were cruising along, and I think he asked where we're going to find our next lift. And I said, we're in lift. He said, what? I said, look at the Vario. We've been cruising at, a blazing 45 knots in the Atlantic. And the Atlantic normally gets about a 20-to-1 glide ratio. At least that's what we think ours does. So normally at that speed, we should be sinking at about 2 knots. But we weren't. For the last minute or so, we'd been sinking only at 1 knot. Of course, the Vario's not beeping. It's still making its droning steady tone. And here we are. I had us, cruising down a line, sinking at 1 knot. So I said, look at the Vario. What's our glide ratio right now? And he did the math and said, about 45. I said, yeah, we're in lift. We're on a line. And he had never heard of such. But he wasn't looking for it. You have to look for that. And I look for it enough now that I hear it in the tone. I don't necessarily have to look at the Vario. I hear the tone get a little better. I don't demand that the Vario beep before it gets my attention. I just hear the tone get a little happier and know that I'm in better air. And that's all it was. It was very subtle. So subtle he didn't even know it was happening till it was pointed out to him. And another why to look for lift lines, there are basically 2 reasons. 1, it provides decreased sink rate. 2, lift lines tend to promote thermals. There's already this light, more or less continuous flow of air upward, and it seems to just collect or trigger thermals. So the more lift is organized into lines, the more important it is that you find and stay on those lines if you want to find another thermal. So the less likely it is there will be a decent thermal anywhere but on a line. In cloud streak conditions, which are really the top end of lift line type conditions, this is very true. Between the cloud streaks, you may not find anything but sink. So the more organized they are, the more that is where the thermals will be. Here's another story. This was the day before a team hang gliding contest at the Tennessee Treetoppers Club near Dunlap, Tennessee, in the Sequatchie Valley. And a lot of us were flying. I had gone down the valley a few miles to the south here, and I was coming back in light ridge lift. And going cross country in ridge lift, you tend to stay low. So as I was approaching, I noticed that right around in this area, there must have been 10 or so hang gliders just sort of milling about. They looked like moths around a porch light. They weren't really organized into what looked like a thermal. Some of them were turning, some of them were flying straight, but they were all several hundred feet higher than I was. And so I immediately thought, lift line. So from a mile or so out, I was watching them thinking, there's very likely a lift line right there, but I'm going to keep cruising because I want something more interesting. I want a real, honest-to-goodness thermal. So I kept flying, flew through their area. Sure enough, the lift was better, even down where I was. Didn't hit a legitimate thermal, kept going. So I went all the way to the end of the ridge here. Said, okay, well, I'll go back and run their lift line upwind, see if there's a thermal there. So I went right back under them all, turned and went upwind, stayed on the lift line, and somewhere right about here hit a legitimate thermal. And in about 3 turns, I was higher than every one of them. And as soon as I was higher than every one of them, all of them came toward me. But I had been flying for 2 hours, and I was tired enough I was ready to land, so I'd be fresh for the next day. But I talked with a few of those guys later, and this is a contest where we welcome beginners and teach them, and we mix the teams up from beginners to advanced pilots. We force the teams to have mixed skill levels. So these were mostly a lot of inexperienced pilots, and they had no idea what was going on. They just knew the lift was a little better right there, so that's where they hung out. They were playing King of the Hill. See who can stay the highest. So let's start talking a little about recognizing a lift line. I've given you some clues already to that. But crossing a lift line feels and sounds a lot like flying through a weak thermal. It's not much happens. You have to be paying attention to notice it. It's not going to rock your wings, throw your nose to the ground, pitch it up to the sky. It's going to be subtle. Your Vario probably won't even beep. Very subtle, just like flying through a weak thermal. And I'm sure that for 15 years, that's what I thought was happening every time I crossed a lift line. I thought, oh, well, that was just a narrow, weak thermal. That's no good. I'm not stopping for that. So what do you do if you think you crossed a lift line? One idea is execute some sort of a thermal search pattern. And one of my lectures is on this very topic, on finding near-miss thermals. It gives you a particular pattern, but whatever your pattern is, or however you go about searching for a thermal you think you just nicked the edge of, that might be a good technique to do right now, if you think it might have been a lift line. And we've probably discussed this before, but if you have the standard hang gliding or paragliding Vario audio setup, or if you have a large quiet zone in your Vario, you might not hear anything. You won't even hear a tone change, a steady tone change. You will hear silence. And I know for several years, it was 15 years that I flew with a big quiet zone. So that's probably a big part of why I missed most of my lift lines. I didn't even think, probably often, I didn't even think that was a weak thermal. I just didn't notice anything at all. But it's difficult to know for sure that it's a lift line until you've stayed on it for a significant distance. I'd call that half a mile to a mile. Until you've stayed on it for that long, you can't really know it was a lift line. Could have been something else. So how do you stay on one? So we basically have to stay on one before we can be sure it even is one, unfortunately. The technique I like is when you're in the best lift, and remember, best lift probably is not even a beeping Vario. It's just the best, the happiest tone from your Vario. When you're in the best lift, turn directly upwind or directly downwind, whichever way is consistent with the direction you're trying to go right now. Or if you don't have a preference, choose upwind. It makes it a little easier for reasons we discuss in part 2 of this series. Next, fly slowly. So slow down. The slower you fly, the slower your ground speed is. This is more or less a ground-based phenomenon, a lift line is, so the slower your ground speed is, the more slowly you will leave the lift line if you're not pointed straight down it. So it helps you to stay on it, to fly slower. Use a light grip, like I said before, trim it to your airspeed. Use a light grip, hands off if it's smooth enough to safely do that. And listen closely to your Vario. You're listening for very small changes in the tone. Feel, or maybe more accurately, watch for a wing to roll. Roll right or roll left. You may not actually feel it in the stick anyway. You might feel it in the seat, but you definitely will see it if you're watching. And look at your ground track. Take note of your ground track because you may need that information as soon as you slip off this line. And hold your ground track steady so that you know what it was. If you're doing a lot of meandering, it's going to be really hard to know what track to get back on. So, you've flown through what might be a line. In the best part of it, you've turned directly upwind or downwind. You're flying as slowly as you safely can, with a very light grip, trimmed properly, listening to your Vario, feeling and watching for a wing to roll, and watching and holding a steady ground track. So while you're doing all this, it won't be long before you think you're falling off your lift line, and you probably will be. They're narrow, and you're not going to stay on them by accident for very long. So you're just waiting for this to happen. And if you drift off the side of the line, which will happen pretty soon unless you're extremely lucky, you'll hear it in your Vario, assuming you have no quiet zone. You'll often feel a slight wing roll. If you're falling off the right side of the line, the wing will roll to the right, because the right wing gets out in air that's not going up as quickly as the left wing. If you're flying straight down the middle of the line, your glider won't turn. In fact, if you're paying enough attention to this, you'll see that wing start rolling while you're still in lift. You don't have to fall all the way off the line to see that you're moving away from the center line of the line. You will often see a change in your ground track also, and this is due to the wing rolling. So as the wing rolls and pulls your nose over to the right or left, your ground track will change. So it's a secondary effect to the wing roll. And it too takes you away from the line. So if you know you've been flying directly toward that lake in the distance, and now your nose is pointed off to the right of that lake, then most likely bring your nose back to the left toward the lake, or a little left of toward the lake, and you'll get back on the line. If your only cue, your only clue was Vario audio though, so you didn't notice a wing roll, didn't see the ground track change, you just heard the Vario audio get a little poorer, then the technique I would use is change heading 45 degrees to the left. It's not all that important which way you choose first. Your odds will be a little better if you choose left, for reasons we'll discuss in the advanced part of this series. So change your heading 45 degrees to one direction. If you can remember left is best, then go left first. Hold it for a few seconds. See what happens. If things get better, then you made the right correction and you're back on your line. And once you get back in the best part of it, make your heading and track what they were before. Or maybe a little bit to the left. Because if you had been holding a constant heading and you flew off the line, then that heading was a little wrong. If you don't find the line again by doing this, then change your heading 90 degrees to the right, or back to the left if you started with a right turn, and hold it twice as long as you did the previous adjustment. This basically undoes your first try and starts again in the other direction as if you had started searching in that direction. And if that doesn't find the line, then the line may either be gone or lower, at a lower altitude where you are now. The line will typically exist from the ground more or less continuously up to a certain height. And the stronger lift is, the higher it goes. So if you're in a stronger section of the line, the lift will reach higher. If you think of a roller coaster, a straight roller coaster, that's sort of what a lift line can be shaped like. And the high points are where the lift is stronger, the low points are where it's weaker. So if you're going from a stronger section to a weaker section, the experience you'll have is, I just flew off this line. And yes, if you were just to trace out the line at your altitude, yep, you flew right off the end of it. But it's possible if you keep flying down that track, you reconnect with the line on the other side of that little dip in the line. That's tough to do, but it's worth pressing on along that line if you just flew off the end of one. And you want to go in that general direction anyway. Now let me give a little nod to Condor and put an idea in your head that maybe will pay off for you too. When I started using Condor, I noticed this setting and I didn't like it. When I started using Condor, I was a hang glider pilot. I had not flown in sailplanes yet. And I didn't like this setting because what it does is it either makes your Vario make noise at all vertical speeds, which I was not accustomed to for 15 years, or it only makes noise when you're climbing. I didn't like that either. So I chose to uncheck this box and let the Vario always be making noise on glide, something I was totally unaccustomed to. It annoyed me to no end. I was not happy about it. But it didn't take long before I started noticing, just before I entered a thermal, and just as I left a thermal, the characteristic changes in the sound of the sync tone. Thought, well, that's interesting. So I started to anticipate a thermal before I otherwise would have. So pretty quickly I started to see value in this. And it wasn't long before I started noticing I was hearing that characteristic tone that says, oh, I'm about to fly into a thermal. And then there wasn't a thermal, even though I held my heading. So I thought, well, maybe I just flew through the edge of a thermal. How could I figure that out? That led me to coming up with a little simple search pattern, and I started being able to find those thermals. And if I had left this box checked, I wouldn't have noticed those thermals. So I made the same change in real life, and that's when I started noticing lift lines, when I got rid of the quiet zone. So Condor helped teach me the value of eliminating a quiet zone when I really did not want that lesson. I didn't know that lesson was there to be had. So you never know what you're going to get out of a simulation. I sure didn't expect that, and that alone was worth way more than I paid for Condor. Here's a slide or two just for a couple of hang gliding and paragliding instruments, recommendations for how I would set them up. That doesn't apply to any of you tonight. And my last story, also in the Sequatchie Valley. You may recognize the topography. I've zoomed out a little bit though. I don't remember if this was the same year, but it was that same type contest that they do every year. And I was headed home on the final leg of my task, kind of late in the day. I had flown pretty slow, tried to hang back and help my teammates, and it was getting soft. It was getting weak. The wind was roughly west to northwest, and north is up in this picture. So I was coming along here, flying down the ridge. Thermals were all but gone. And I really wanted to make goal, of course, and I thought for sure I had goal made. But my truck was back here at the landing field below launch where I was camping. So it would have been more convenient to fly this 8 miles from the goal LZ back to the home LZ where my truck was waiting, and maybe even then go retrieve my teammates if needed. So my idea was I'm going to tag goal and then fly 8 miles back. But it was really late in the day, and I knew the only way I could do it, because I didn't think there were any more thermals to be had, and there weren't. So I was looking for a lift line, flying down this ridge lift at the breakneck ground speed of maybe 15 miles per hour, 20, which is about what you get in a hang glider in soarable winds. Feeling and listening for a lift line. The hope was that there would be a lift line near enough my goal LZ that I could fly out the lift line, tag goal, get back on the lift line, run it back to the ridge, get back to the ridge at or slightly above ridge height so that I could still use the weak ridge lift, bolstered by the setting sun. It wasn't that late, but the afternoon sun, and make it back to my truck. And sure enough, right about here was a lift line. So I did a few figure eights here to get as high as I could in it to give myself the best chance, and I flew 2 miles up this lift line until I was just a little bit past straight alongside. Then I pointed crosswind, let the wind drift me a little, tagged the 1/4 mile radius cylinder, aimed back crosswind, drifted a little, got back on the line, ran it back to the ridge, got there just a little above ridge height, and was able to float back home in ridge lift. And I'm sure that had that lift line not been there, I would not have had the altitude to go out and tag the goal and get back to the ridge high enough to use the ridge lift. Very subtle, weak ridge lift line rather, late in the day, and it helped me add 8 miles, which for a hang glider, that's decent. So we're almost done. In summary, if you don't have your Vario set up this way already, I strongly encourage you to set it so that you hear Vario audio, that is vertical speed audio, at all vertical speeds and even on glide. So this means no quiet zone and climb mode even on glide. Climb mode audio even on glide. Fly with a light grip and with a glider tuned to fly straight, hands off. When you're on a line, or at least you think you're on a line, fly slow, look at your ground track and for whether your wings are getting rolled. Listen to the very subtle changes in your tone from your Vario, and feel for the glider being very gently banked. And that's as much a looking thing as a feeling thing. Also, I haven't said this yet, but don't expect lift lines to be perfectly straight. You've probably noticed this even if you've seen many days with classic cloud streeting. You've probably noticed then that even on the really strongly streeted days, the streets aren't perfectly straight. And I expect that the less organized the streeting or the lines are, the less straight they'll be, the more meandering. So you can't expect to just lock into a heading and hold it forever. You're constantly having to reassess and follow this line even if it turns a little bit. Now they won't turn 90 degrees, but they may turn 10 or 15 degrees over the course of a mile or two. And don't expect lift lines to be aligned exactly with the wind at your altitude. We'll get into the reasons for that in the advanced part of this. But don't lock your mind into that way of thinking, that if I point the nose straight into the wind, I will stay on the line, and if I fall off the line doing that, I must have gone off the end of the line, not the side. Not true. A simple way that might help you prove that until you can participate in the advanced session is the wind normally changes direction with altitude. And how can this one line be oriented differently at different altitudes? I submit to you that it can't. And we'll talk a good bit about that in the advanced one. They can meander, as I mentioned before, and they are usually aligned left of the wind at your altitude in the northern hemisphere. So if you're flying upwind and you're pointed straight into the wind, you will more than likely go off the right side of the line. That's why I told you earlier, it's a best bet to start by searching left after you fall off a line. Before I learned this lesson, I was about ready to adjust my hang glider for a turn because I had been on a lift line for a while in that flight, and I kept falling off to the right every time. So I made a note in my logbook, glider has a right turn. And later, as I pondered it and studied lift lines more, I realized, no, it doesn't. I just didn't know what I was doing. I was flying straight into the wind when I should have been flying a few degrees left of straight into the wind. And compared to more or less random flying, not knowing anything about lift lines or how they orient or where they might be. And with a large quiet zone, hopefully you'll find, as I have, that you'll find somewhere around twice as many thermals by using lift lines. And that when you're on a lift line, an average run-of-the-mill everyday lift line can double the glide ratio of a glider with a 2-knot sink rate. So I'd say about 1 knot is fairly common in an everyday lift line. And here's a teaser of some of the topics we'll talk about in the advanced concepts session. I hope you'll join me for that. I'm in the process of trying to schedule it. It's probably going to be either next week or the next. We'll talk about some theories, how lift lines are formed, how they're oriented, so forth. We'll look at some charts, some animations, some proofs of concepts. We'll talk about the effect of changing wind direction with altitude, which I mentioned briefly a minute ago. We'll talk about why lift lines usually are not oriented exactly with the wind at your altitude. And of course, we'll talk about how are they oriented? Why you'll usually fall off the right side. I more or less just told you that, but we'll get into that in some detail. Why upwind and downwind headings to stay on a line are not exact opposites. So if you're on a north heading flying upwind up a line, you might intuitively think, well, if I turn to a south heading, I should stay on the line too, right? Not true. We'll talk about why. Why it's easier to stay on a lift line when flying upwind. I more or less already told you that. It's ground speed, lower ground speed. But we'll get into that more. We'll discuss the ideal heading to jump from one line or street to the next, if your goal is to lose as little altitude as possible. We'll answer the question, which is easier, to cross over to the line or street to your left or the one to your right? It is one of the two. And while I find all of these things interesting, you know, they're kind of geeky, like me. There's science involved. A lot of theoretical discussion. A lot of these are questions and my notions. It doesn't mean they're the truth. It means they're my best guess at the truth right now. But while all this is interesting to me, and it might be to you, you won't get as much out of the advanced session as you hopefully will get out of what we just talked about tonight. So deal with the fundamentals first before you bump the fundamentals out of your mind and push some of this advanced stuff into it. That's all I have for tonight. Any questions or comments? Imagine driving down a road through a flat field on a farm. Let's say it's just a gravel road, 1 lane wide, and it's very crowned. So if you're a little bit to the right or a little to the left of center, your vehicle, whatever you're driving, wants to sort of pull off toward the ditch. So now imagine you're riding down that thing blindfolded. And you're having to sense for your vehicle drifting to one side to keep it on the road. That's a lot easier to do going slow. Because if you're going fast and you get just a few degrees off, you're in the ditch before you know you're off. So it's that same kind of idea.